Power means nothing if you can't protect the person standing in the cold. That thought didn't belong in my head during Christmas dinner, but somehow it did. The ballroom of my estate was glowing with gold light and evergreen garlands. A 20-foot Christmas tree stood beside the fireplace, covered in glass ornaments and soft white lights. The long dining table was filled with people who controlled banks, shipping routes, construction empires. Crystal glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. A violin played somewhere in the corner. Everything looked perfect. That's what powerful men like to believe on nights like this. Perfect control, perfect order, perfect celebration. I sat at the head of the table, watching the room the way I always did. Quiet, calculating. That's when I noticed something small, something missing. Emily's chair near the service door was empty. She was usually there, silent, attentive, moving between the kitchen and the table like a shadow nobody questioned. She poured wine, replaced plates, refolded napkins when guests made a mess of them. Most people in that room probably didn't even know her name. But I did. Emily Carter, 23. Soft voice, careful steps. The kind of person who apologized even when nothing was her fault. I glanced toward the kitchen doors. No movement. Strange. Emily never disappeared during dinner service. Especially not tonight. Christmas dinner in my house wasn't casual. Everything followed a schedule measured down to the minute. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Something felt wrong. Not loud wrong. Quiet wrong. The kind you only notice if you're used to watching details other people miss. Outside the tall windows behind the dining table, snow was falling in slow white spirals. The estate grounds stretched out under the winter night. Stone paths, iron gates, frozen gardens dusted with powder. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset. The news earlier said it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. Cold enough to sting the lungs when you breathe too deep. I set my glass down. No one noticed. They were busy discussing markets and holiday travel and the illusion that the world obeyed them. I stood up slowly. A few heads turned, expecting a toast. I said nothing. I simply walked away from the table. The music kept playing behind me as I crossed the marble floor toward the back corridor. Warm air from the dining room faded the moment I opened the side door leading outside. The cold hit instantly, sharp and clean. Snow crunched under my shoes as I stepped onto the stone path. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Then I saw them. Footprints. Small ones. Fresh in the snow. They started near the service entrance. And they went straight across the yard toward the garden gate. I followed them. Each step slower than the last, because something in my chest was tightening with every yard. The wind shifted. A lantern by the gate flickered, and under that pale yellow light, I saw a figure in the snow. I stopped a few steps away because for a moment my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. The lantern beside the garden gate swung slowly in the wind, casting a weak golden circle over the snow, and inside that light was a small figure kneeling in the drift. Emily Carter. She was still holding a silver serving tray in both hands, as if she had been frozen in the middle of her work. Snow had gathered on her shoulders and in her dark hair. Her head was lowered. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible in the cold air. For a second the world became very quiet. No music, no laughter, just the wind moving through the iron bars of the gate and the soft sound of snow touching the ground. I walked closer. Each step made a sharp crunch under my shoes. Emily did not react at first. She was trembling so lightly, it almost looked like the movement of the falling snow itself. When I reached her, I crouched down and said her name softly. Emily. Her head lifted just a little, like someone waking from a distant dream. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy from the cold. I could see confusion there, and something else that made my chest tighten. Apology. As if she believed she had done something wrong. I gently took the tray from her hands and set it in the snow. Her fingers stayed curled in the same position, stiff from the freezing air. When I touched her hand, it felt like holding a piece of ice. The temperature outside could not have been higher than 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and she had been kneeling directly in the snow. Her uniform coat was thin, meant for working inside a warm house, not for standing outside in winter. Emily looked at me again, trying to focus. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I was told to wait here." The words settled in the air between us. Told to wait here. I looked around the yard slowly, as if the answer might be hidden somewhere in the darkness. The garden was silent. The windows of the mansion glowed warmly behind us, filled with light and celebration. Inside those walls, people were drinking wine that cost more than most families spend in a month. Meanwhile, one of the quietest workers in the house had been left outside in the freezing night like she did not belong to the same world. I placed my coat over her shoulders without thinking. The heavy fabric swallowed her small frame immediately. She tried to protest, but the words came out weak. "You should not be here in the cold, sir." I almost laughed at that. Even half frozen, she was worried about me. I slipped one arm under her shoulders and the other behind her back and lifted her gently from the snow. She was lighter than I expected, and she shivered the moment the wind touched her again. From this distance, I could see the faint trail of her footprints stretching all the way from the service door across the yard. That meant she had walked here obediently, step by step, because someone told her to. I carried her toward the house slowly. The warm lights grew brighter with every step. Behind those windows, the music was still playing, and my guests were still celebrating Christmas, as if nothing in the world could disturb their perfect evening. But something had already changed. Because the moment I stepped back inside with Emily in my arms, one question was burning quietly in my mind. Who told her to stand outside in the snow? The warm air inside the house wrapped around us the moment the door closed behind me, but Emily was still shaking in my arms like the cold had followed her inside. The music from the dining room drifted down the corridor again, soft violins and quiet laughter, as if the world inside these walls had no idea what had just happened outside in the snow. I carried her across the marble floor toward the sitting room near the fireplace. The fire was already burning there, bright orange flames rising and falling behind the iron screen. I lowered her carefully onto the couch beside it and pulled another blanket from the chair nearby, wrapping it around her shoulders over my coat. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at the flames as if her body was trying to remember what warmth felt like. Her fingers were still stiff. Her lips were pale. I crouched beside the couch and gently rubbed her hands between mine, trying to bring the feeling back. Emily blinked slowly, her eyes finally beginning to focus again. "I am sorry, sir," she said again, her voice trembling slightly. "I did not mean to cause trouble during dinner." The words made something inside me tighten. Trouble. She thought being left outside in freezing weather was somehow her fault. "You did not cause trouble," I told her quietly. "You were following instructions." She hesitated before answering, like she was unsure if speaking more would make things worse. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "I was told to wait outside until the guests finished dinner." I studied her face carefully. Emily had always been the kind of person who tried to stay invisible. She moved quietly, spoke carefully, never complained about long hours or difficult tasks. That was probably why nobody expected anyone to notice when she disappeared. But I had noticed. And now the question sitting in my mind was growing heavier by the second. "Who told you that, Emily?" I asked. Her eyes flickered down toward the carpet for a moment before she answered. "Mr. Davenport," she said. The name hung in the air like a shadow. Harold Davenport was the head of household staff, the man responsible for making sure everything in this estate ran smoothly. He had worked here for years. Organized, strict, loyal, at least on the surface. If he told someone to do something, they did it without question. Emily pulled the blanket tighter around herself and glanced nervously toward the hallway leading back to the dining room. "I thought it must have been important," she added quietly. "He said the guests should not see the staff walking around during the main dinner course. So he asked me to step outside for a little while." A little while. I remembered the trail of footprints stretching across the yard and disappearing under fresh snow. That had not been a few minutes. That had been long enough for frost to gather in her hair and for her hands to turn ice cold. I stood slowly and looked toward the bright lights of the dining room at the end of the corridor. My guests were still sitting at the table, still eating, still celebrating Christmas. They had no idea what had just happened 100 feet away in the garden. Behind me, the fire crackled softly as Emily finally stopped shaking quite as much. I reached for a glass of warm water from the side table and placed it in her hands. "Drink slowly," I said. She nodded obediently. Then I turned back toward the hallway, because now there was only one thing left to do. I needed to ask Harold Davenport why a young woman working under my roof had been left kneeling in the snow on Christmas night. I walked down the corridor toward the dining room slowly, but every step felt heavier than the last. The sound of conversation grew louder as I approached. Laughter, glasses touching. Someone was telling a story about a winter trip to Aspen. For them the night was still perfect. Warm lights. Expensive wine. A Christmas dinner designed to impress powerful people. I pushed the doors open and stepped back inside the room. The long table was still glowing under the chandelier. Gold plates. Crystal glasses. Candles reflecting in polished silver. Several guests looked up immediately when they saw me return, but this time I was not alone. The cold air that followed me into the room seemed to carry something else with it. Silence. The violin in the corner stopped playing mid-note when the musician noticed the change in the atmosphere. I walked to the head of the table again, but did not sit down. Instead, I let my eyes move slowly across the room until they landed on the man standing near the service wall. Harold Davenport. He was exactly where he always was during dinners like this. Back straight, hands folded neatly in front of him, watching the staff with careful attention, making sure everything looked perfect for the guests. His expression did not change when he noticed me looking at him. If anything, he looked calmly professional, like a man who had done nothing wrong. I spoke quietly, but in a room like that quiet words travel far. Mr. Davenport, I said, please come here for a moment. Chairs shifted slightly around the table as the guests sensed something unusual unfolding. Davenport walked forward without hesitation. His shoes made soft sounds against the marble floor. He stopped a few feet from me and nodded politely. Yes, sir. Is there something you require for the dinner service? I studied his face carefully. Years of dealing with powerful men had taught him how to control his expressions. Calm, respectful, unreadable. But the question in my mind was already settled. Emily Carter is sitting in the sitting room beside the fireplace, I said slowly. Her hands are still cold from the snow outside. The room became so quiet that even the crackle of candles could be heard. Davenport did not immediately answer. His eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second before returning to their usual steady calm. I see, sir, he replied. I was going to bring her back inside shortly. She was asked to step outside briefly so the staff movement would not distract the guests during the main dinner course. His explanation was delivered in the same professional tone he used for everything else in this house. Organized, controlled, logical on the surface. But something in the room shifted the moment the words left his mouth. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, because even they understood what 28-degree weather meant in the middle of a winter night. I looked at him for another moment before speaking again. Briefly, I repeated. The words sounded different when I said it. Slower. He gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Only for a short time. I leaned one hand against the back of my chair and let the silence stretch across the entire dining room. Then I asked the question that mattered. Mr. Davenport, did you personally check to see whether she was still standing outside in the snow? For a moment, Harold Davenport did not answer. The silence stretched across the dining room like a thin sheet of ice, fragile and cold. Around the table, the guests had stopped pretending to focus on their meals. Forks rested quietly against plates. Wine glasses remained untouched. Everyone was listening now. Davenport adjusted the cuffs of his jacket slightly before speaking, the movement slow and deliberate. I expected the situation to be handled quickly, sir, he said in the same careful tone he always used. The staff was busy with dinner service, and I assumed Miss Carter understood the instruction. His words were calm, but they did not answer the question. I kept my eyes on him. So you did not check, I said. He hesitated for a brief moment, and that hesitation said more than any explanation. I believed it would only be a few minutes, he replied. His voice was still controlled, but the room had already begun to change around us. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another quietly set down his glass. Because the truth behind those polite sentences was becoming very clear. Emily had been sent outside. No one had checked on her. And the dinner inside had continued as if nothing was wrong. I folded my hands behind my back and walked slowly along the side of the table. The chandelier above us cast long reflections across the polished wood. Outside the tall windows, snow continued to fall steadily across the dark gardens. When you gave the instruction, I asked, did Miss Carter argue with you? No, sir, Davenport answered quickly. She followed the instruction immediately. Of course she did. Emily Carter was the kind of person who followed instructions even when they made no sense. Even when they put her outside in freezing weather while everyone else remained warm inside. I stopped walking and looked directly at him again. The temperature outside tonight is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, I said quietly. cold enough that even a short time can become dangerous if someone is not dressed for it. Davenport did not respond this time. His eyes moved briefly toward the windows and then back to me. I noticed something else in that moment. It was not fear. Not exactly. It was the realization that the situation had become larger than he expected. Several guests at the table exchanged looks again. They were powerful people in their own worlds, but they were guests here. And in this house, everyone understood one simple rule. What happened under my roof was my responsibility. I let the silence grow for a few seconds longer before speaking again. Emily Carter has worked here for nearly a year, I said. Quietly, reliably, without complaint. Yet tonight she was standing alone in the snow while the rest of us sat comfortably at this table. Davenport straightened slightly. I assure you, sir, there was no harmful intention behind the instruction. It was simply part of maintaining order during the dinner service. Order. The word echoed faintly in the room. I looked down at the empty chair near the service door where Emily usually stood during dinners like this. Then I looked back at Davenport. Order should never require someone to freeze outside on Christmas night, I said. The words were not loud, but they carried through the entire room. And suddenly everyone at the table understood something very clearly. This dinner was no longer the most important thing happening in the house tonight. No one in the room spoke after that. The candles on the table flickered gently, and the snow outside the tall windows continued to fall in slow white layers across the dark garden. Harold Davenport remained standing in front of me, his posture still professional, but something in the air had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. The guests around the table understood it as well. This was no longer a conversation about dinner service. This was about something deeper than that. I walked slowly back toward the head of the table and rested my hand against the chair without sitting down. For a moment, I looked around the room at the faces watching us. Bankers, investors, men who believed power came from money and influence. But power was not only about control. It was also about responsibility. I turned my attention back to Davenport. When someone works under this roof, I said calmly, they are under my protection. That includes the quiet ones who nobody notices. Emily Carter is part of this household just like everyone else who serves here. Davenport nodded slightly, though the confidence in his expression had begun to fade. Of course, sir. I understand your concern. I did not intend for the situation to last that long. Intentions are not what matter tonight, I replied. What matters is that it happened. A few guests shifted in their chairs again. One of them cleared his throat softly, but did not interrupt. They all understood that the evening had changed direction. I glanced once more toward the empty service position near the door where Emily normally stood during dinners. That place had always seemed ordinary before tonight. Just another quiet corner of the room where staff waited to refill glasses or bring another course from the kitchen. But now it looked different. Now it looked like the place where someone had quietly disappeared and nobody had asked why. I looked back at Davenport again. From this moment forward, I said slowly, no member of the staff is to be sent outside during service without proper reason and proper clothing. Not on a winter night. Not on any night. The rule applies to everyone in this house. Davenport straightened slightly and nodded again. Understood, sir. His voice was quieter now. Good, I said. Then there is one more thing. I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle again across the long table. Tonight is Christmas, a night that is supposed to remind people of kindness, not indifference. The staff of this house works hard every single day to keep everything running smoothly. They deserve respect for that. Several guests lowered their eyes slightly, as if the words were directed at more than just one man. I turned toward the dining table again and finally sat down in my chair. The movement seemed to release the tension that had filled the room for the past several minutes. Conversation slowly began to return in cautious whispers. But the dinner no longer felt the same. Because somewhere in the house, near the warm glow of a fireplace, a young woman was still recovering from standing alone in the snow. And for the first time that night, I realized something else quietly forming in the back of my mind. When Emily Carter had looked at me earlier beside the garden gate, there had been something hanging from her neck. A small silver necklace that caught the lantern light for just a moment before the snow covered it again. And for some reason, that small detail felt strangely familiar. The dinner slowly returned to motion, but the warmth of the room felt different now. Conversations restarted in softer voices, careful and uncertain, like people were suddenly aware of something they had not noticed before. The candles continued to burn along the table, and the violin player quietly resumed the music, yet my attention was no longer on the dinner. My thoughts kept returning to the sitting room down the hall where Emily Carter was resting near the fire. I picked up my glass of water, but did not drink. Instead, I looked again toward the tall windows where snow was still falling across the dark garden. Somewhere out there, the wind was erasing the footprints that had led me to her. The image refused to leave my mind. A small figure kneeling in the snow, hands stiff from the cold, still holding a serving tray as if she believed she had to keep working no matter what happened. After a few minutes, I quietly stood from my chair again. No one asked where I was going this time. The room understood that the evening had already changed. I walked through the corridor toward the sitting room, the sounds of the dinner fading behind me step by step. When I reached the doorway, I saw the firelight moving across the walls in slow orange waves. Emily was still sitting on the couch where I had left her. The blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and the glass of warm water rested in both of her hands. She looked a little stronger now. The color had slowly returned to her face, and the shaking had almost stopped. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she straightened slightly. "I am sorry if I caused trouble during your dinner, sir," she said softly. "I told you before," I replied as I stepped into the room. "You did not cause any trouble." The fire crackled gently beside us. I pulled a chair closer and sat across from her, so I could see her clearly in the light. That was when I noticed the small silver necklace again. The chain rested against the collar of her uniform, and a small pendant hung at the center. Earlier outside in the snow, it had only caught the lantern light for a brief second, but now the firelight revealed it clearly. The shape was simple but familiar. Too familiar. My eyes stayed on it longer than I intended. Emily noticed the direction of my gaze and instinctively touched the pendant with her fingers. "Oh," she said quietly, "this old thing. I have had it since I was a child." She held it gently between her hands as if it carried some private memory. Something about the design stirred a distant memory in my mind. A memory from many years ago, long before this house and the empire that surrounded it. I leaned forward slightly. "Where did you get that necklace, Emily?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment, as if the question surprised her. "My mother gave it to me," she answered softly. "She said it belonged to someone who helped our family a long time ago." I felt the room grow very still around us, because in the warm glow of the fireplace, looking at that small silver pendant again, I realized why it seemed so familiar. I had seen that exact symbol once before, and it was connected to a night from my past that I had never forgotten. Emily's fingers slowly turned the small silver pendant in the firelight as if it were something fragile. The flames beside us moved gently, reflecting across the smooth metal surface. I leaned forward slightly, studying the symbol engraved on it. A small compass rose surrounded by a thin, circular border. Simple, elegant, and unmistakably familiar. For a moment the room seemed to fall silent except for the crackling of the fire, because that symbol belonged to a memory I had not thought about in many years. Emily noticed the change in my expression and lowered the necklace slowly. "Is something wrong, sir?" she asked quietly. I did not answer right away. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes drift toward the window beside the fireplace. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and endless under the dark sky. It reminded me of another winter night long ago. "I remember that pendant," I said slowly. Emily looked surprised. "You do, sir?" I nodded once. Many years ago, there was a small family that lived in an old neighborhood near the shipping district. The winter storms there were always harsh. Cold winds from the harbor could freeze the streets overnight. One evening I passed through that area during a snowstorm and saw a small house with no lights except for a single candle in the window. Emily listened quietly, her hands resting around the glass of warm water again. "The family inside that house was struggling," I continued. "The father had lost his job and the winter had been difficult for them. They had very little food and almost no heat. I only stayed there for a short time, just long enough to help them get through that winter night." Emily's eyes widened slightly as she listened. "My mother used to tell me a story like that," she said softly. "A man helped our family one winter when things were very hard. She never knew his name. She only said he appeared when we needed help the most." I looked at the pendant again as the memory settled fully into place. "Before I left that house, I gave the family a small gift," I said. "Something simple so they would remember that kindness still existed in the world even during difficult times." Emily slowly lifted the pendant again and stared at it in the firelight. My mother told me the man gave her this necklace, she whispered. She said it was meant to remind our family to keep going forward no matter how cold life became. The room grew very still again. Emily looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and disbelief beginning to form in her eyes. Sir, she said quietly, are you saying you were the one who helped my family that night? I did not answer immediately. I simply watched the firelight reflect across the small silver compass between her fingers, because the truth was becoming clear in a way neither of us expected. On a freezing Christmas night years ago, our paths had crossed for the first time. And now, without either of us knowing it, they had crossed again. The firelight reflected softly across the small silver compass as Emily held it between her fingers, her eyes still searching my face for an answer. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Outside the window the snow continued to fall quietly over the gardens, covering the footprints that had led me to her earlier that night. I leaned forward slightly and studied the pendant again, remembering the winter night from years ago with surprising clarity. The small house, the candle in the window, a family trying to stay warm while the storm moved through the streets. I did not know that family very well, I said slowly. I only remember that they needed help and that winter was especially cold. Emily lowered the pendant into her palm and looked down at it, as if she was seeing it for the first time. My mother always said that night changed everything for us, she said quietly. After that winter things slowly became better. My father found work again, and we were able to move to a safer neighborhood. She always told me to keep this necklace close because it reminded her that kindness can appear when people least expect it. The room remained calm and warm around us while her words settled into the silence. I looked at her carefully then, not as the quiet maid who worked in my house, but as the child from that distant winter story who had grown up without ever knowing the name of the person who helped her family. Sometimes life moves in strange circles, I said softly. People cross paths without realizing how connected their stories really are. Emily finally looked up again, the surprise in her expression slowly changing into something deeper. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. I never imagined that the man my mother talked about would be sitting here in front of me one day, she said. Especially not like this. Especially not on a night like tonight. I gave a small, thoughtful smile. Neither did I. The fire beside us cracked gently, and the warmth in the room felt stronger now, almost comforting after everything that had happened outside in the cold garden. For a moment neither of us spoke again. Emily wrapped the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders, though the color had fully returned to her face. Thank you, she said after a while. Not just for tonight. For everything you did for my family back then. I shook my head slightly. That night I only did what anyone should have done, I replied. What matters is what people choose to do afterward. She looked down at the necklace again, and then back at me with a quiet determination in her eyes that had not been there before. My mother always told me that if life ever gave me the chance, I should return kindness the same way it was given to us, she said. That is why I work hard. That is why I try not to complain about difficult days. I listened to her words carefully, realizing that the quiet strength I had noticed in her from the beginning was not an accident. It came from the lessons her family had carried forward for years. Outside the storm continued to cover the estate in fresh snow, but inside the sitting room the fire burned steadily, casting warm light across the walls. I looked at the small compass pendant one more time, and then met her eyes again. Sometimes, the smallest choices shape the future in ways we never expect, I said quietly. Years ago I helped a family during a winter storm without knowing where their path would lead. Tonight that same path brought one of them back into my house. And somehow, on this Christmas night, the circle finally closed.